to do your thing. Okay. Welcome to everybody on YouTube Live. Today we are having our webinar with oh my God, your name wouldn't come out, Jon Shellenberger, recovering historical trauma in tribal communities and empowering tribal sovereignty in CRM. And thankfully nobody's watching right now. But Jon has several years of experience working within the realm of archaeology. He received a BS in anthropology and MS in cultural resource management from Central Washington University. Past experience includes being lead Yakama Nation archaeologist and ethnographer, adjunct instructor of Falmouth Institute, and project manager with Central Washington Anthropological Survey, and recently just received a position as archaeologist at Washington State Department Fish and Wildlife, and is owner of Native Anthro. Just a little backstory. I did meet Jon at the last SAA conference. Very engaging speaker. While I was listening to him speak, I text Les. I'm like, Les, we have to get this guy on the show to do a webinar for us. And then I had to wait in line to talk to Jon because so many people were standing in line to talk to him, and my friend was getting hungry and she cut the line so we didn't talk to him. And we got him here for you to discuss Indigenous perspective in CRM with you today and boarding schools. So very excited to have you on here, Jon. I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to you to do your thing.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I too was hungry at that conference and ready to go to lunch. So thank you for your patience and hanging in there. And I really appreciate being a part of this and sharing stuff that I care about. And I know a lot of my former coworkers and colleagues here care a great deal about as well. So anytime you get an opportunity to be a voice for the resource, it's a big deal. It's a great thing. So thank you very much for that. So as was mentioned, I'm Jon Shellenberger. I'm an enrolled member of the Yakama Nation. I'm also a descendant of the Wintu and also the Cowlitz tribe. I have 3 kids and a wife. We all live on the reservation here in Yakima, Central Washington, near Yakima, Washington, the Palm Springs of Washington. As it's there's a big sign outside the city or right by the city that says the Palm Springs of Washington, so people kind of laugh at that, but anyway, as was mentioned, I'm currently the Department of Fish and Wildlife archaeologist. I'm one of several, mainly working towards restoring shrub steppe habitat, which is the habitat that contains many of our traditional foods and plants. They're significant to plateau peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The plateau is bounded on the west by the Pacific Northwest tribes, and on the east by the plains. So there's a great number of tribes going all the way up into Canada, southern BC, down into Oregon, Idaho, containing all of these numerous tribes with several different linguistic families, sharing many common adaptations to a largely desert environment. So we've been able to carve a life for thousands and thousands of years in an area that's received, in some places, less than 9 inches of rain in a year. So that's just to kind of give you a background of what my home is like. On our reservation, we are the home of the first on-reservation Indian boarding school. In 1819, you had the Indian Civilization Act that was passed. The act was ironically passed in order to save the Native Americans from decline. There were declining numbers. And so they passed this in order to save them. And their idea of saving Indians at the time was to turn them into white people, Christian, landowning, farming, white people. which was somewhat strange, since several of the tribes in the East were already practicing agriculture. Like the Cherokee, they kind of scoffed at this act, like, you want us to be farmers, but we're already farmers. So they were already it was kind of funny. It was kind of humorous, I guess you could say, in a way. So they passed this act, but it really wasn't until the 1860s that things got kicked off with the establishment of boarding schools on reservations across the United States. But even prior to that, there were Indian boarding schools at Harvard, Dartmouth back in the 1600s. You had them in the East Coast, but this Civilization Act and then the activities that took place in the 1860s was what's understood as the federal Indian boarding school system, and the beginnings of that. And then after 1860, when our boarding school was established, 19 years later, off-reservation boarding schools were established by Pratt, who conducted experiments with prisoners that were sent to Florida. They were, I guess, POWs from the Kiowa, Comanches, other Plains tribes that were in Oklahoma. They were shipped off to Florida, Fort Marion, and they conducted these civilization experiments on them. And based on that work that he did, he established the Carlisle Indian School, which is the very first off-reservation boarding school. Because at the time, on-reservation boarding schools weren't seen as effective, because the children weren't taken out of their environment. And as they saw, when you removed those Indians to Florida, that had a huge impact. Those isolation had a huge impact on trying to break these individuals. So the boarding schools, many of you have probably have been hearing about all of the atrocities that took place there. And I don't really want to unpack all of that. I don't really feel like this is the place or the time to do that. But it was horrible. But that also left all those boarding schools and all of those activities off reservation, on reservation, left marks on the land. It left ancestral remains. It left historic buildings. All of this significant archaeology that has a meaning to our people. Now, it's a different meaning than looking at a village site. It's different, or a sacred Vision Quest site. It's tied to trauma, past trauma, and that trauma really hasn't gotten the recognition that it's deserved until like 2 years ago, when the Kamloops Indian Band came forward in the media in May, like 27th, 2021, notifying the public that they had found 215 unmarked graves near the Kamloops Indian residential school. And in Canada, this kicked off a nationwide effort to identify unmarked graves at Indian residential schools. In the US, it kicked off a Department of Interior looking more closely at Indian boarding schools, where they were at, the number of them, and they compiled a report, how many schools there were. And then there was legislation that's been proposed for the last 3 years. It's been proposed in 2023 by Warren. Whether or not that will gain traction, we don't know. But that is to establish the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools, which will oversee this effort to identify boarding school students past, how many there were, who they were, the various, I guess, atrocities that they suffered, as well as this issue about unmarked graves at these residential or boarding schools. So currently we're trying to identify unmarked graves at Fort Simcoe Indian Boarding School. on our reservation. It's the first on reservation boarding school, which is largely volunteer. And just last year, I purchased a GPR with the help of a local group that partially funded that. And then I reinvested from my own business to buy this GPR. And it, as a way to help. And because I felt like it was very important to be a part of this work. Because at the time I was I quit. I resigned from the tribe. I was burnt out. I was tired. We fought a lot of legal battles. A lot of my coworkers are still there. They're still fighting. CRM kicked me in the butt. It was very disheartening, some of the things that we saw, and it just accumulated over time. It just really had an impact on me personally. And so like 2 weeks into 2 weeks after I resigned, this information about Kamloops hit. And so I was kind of sucked back in emotionally, and I felt like I had a place again. My best friend growing up since we were like 12 was from Kamloops. His family had went to that boarding school, all his uncles and his father. And I just felt like I needed to help. I felt like I had probably more than most people that they know, I have at my disposal, or at, arm's grasp, the tools and the skills to be able to do something. And I didn't care about money. I just wanted answers, right? Because I was emotionally moved by this, and I still am. And it's what drives me to get those answers for our people. And now we're like 2 years into this investigation, which is slow. It goes slow. Like there's no quick answers to it. And so I guess, looking at these past traumas and taking this time to look at how things have played out on the land, it got me really thinking about how this has impacted us as Native communities, tribal communities, but also as Native people as a whole, and how that's impacted our entire trajectory of our lives, on a personal level, community level, how that's impacted us in education, how it's impacted us in terms of our relationship to the land, our relationship to the resources, and also getting education and fighting for those resources. So we're kind of having now the opportunities to undo everything that's been done before. And that process is new. There's no precedence for decolonization in the United States. And I don't think there's much of a precedent anywhere where you have an indigenous population that's been colonized the way we have, survived it, and now arming ourselves with the methods and the tools necessary to answer questions that we don't have. Why don't we have answers to these things? Why don't we know these things? We are a people of oral tradition, yet that oral tradition was stymied by systematic abuse that was part of the policy for boarding schools. I mean, if an Indian child wasn't compliant, if they refused to not speak their tribal language, if they refused not to pray in their traditional manner or anything like that, they were punished. They were starved. Like one of the most common methods of I guess torture was starving. So you just starve a child out and until they were gave up. And so all of these different things. I mean, this was all systematic, and I think that the fact that the United States is just becoming aware of this is is big, right? It's a big part of the process, and recognizing that there's an actual problem, because growing up we always heard about Indian boarding schools and that they were traumatic, that they had an impact, they were talked about at our community events. But now it feels like there's no way to ignore it. As soon as those children were, found, they couldn't ignore it. You couldn't turn away from it. And I think that's just one of the ways that our ancestors speak, and our sites, our resources, they speak without having a voice. And so now we know what they're saying. It's our responsibility to be a voice for them, because they can only go so far. They can't GPR themselves. They can't relocate themselves. They can't, set up memorial markers or fences or anything like that. It's up to us to do something about it. And so that's what I'm doing. That's why I'm here. But anyway, sorry, I'm gonna take a water. Anyway, that's a lot to unpack. That's a lot to process. And I know that a lot of the non-native archaeologists, this is completely foreign. Even to my colleagues, I have to give this backstory about boarding schools to a lot of non-native archaeologists, because they didn't grow up in this system. They didn't grow up seeing their grandmother or their grandfather or their mother or their father suffer the effects of boarding schools. But that's an everyday thing here on reservation, or in our Indian families, having to deal with that reality. So yes, it is a lot to take in. So if it feels like, if you're, as an archaeologist, a non-native archaeologist, you're thinking, oh, well, what can I do to help? And I hear that a lot, and I get that a lot, and I appreciate that. And I think when a lot of folks just get that deer in headlights look, when I explain to them that human remains of Native Americans were completely disregarded and desecrated and disrespected, people just didn't care. And that isn't totally unique. To Native Americans. They didn't care about Chinese graves, they didn't care about African American graves, they didn't really care about pauper graves. I've done enough work in cemeteries to see how much people really care about the undesirables. They're a mess. Our cemeteries are a mess. Not just native, but non-native as well. So it's devastating to see that, especially when Native American, when your own people are involved in a situation where gravestones were bulldozed, and we no longer know where those people are at. And they were bulldozed because they didn't care. The people that ran the cemetery didn't care enough to leave those markers. They want to leave them there because they wanted non-natives to come in here and bury themselves. And I thought if natives were there, then they wouldn't want to be buried there. That kind of situation. And the same goes if they found out Chinese burials were there, they didn't want to be buried there. So there's kind of this segregation that would go on, even in cemeteries, that maybe a lot of people aren't even aware of. But that's a lot to unpack, because we think of cemeteries now where you buy a plot and that's where you're buried. That's not always how it went. Burials were, new graves were dug into old graves. And if they saw bones, they just remove them, native or non-native. We've cleaned up enough of those messes, screened enough dirt, and found enough bones and back dirt to know that it's a mess. How we handle those cemeteries we need to do better. But when you explain this to the non-native archaeologists, the usual impact, the usual responses, like, they can't believe that this actually happened. It's shock, right? It's really shocking to hear that type of disrespect, because I think a lot of us, we don't devalue human remains. I think all of us in archaeology genuinely have a respect for our past remains, past artifacts, past sites. I mean, I like to think that everybody thinks that or has that appreciation, but it's difficult. It's challenging. It's challenging to give out volunteers to line up that time, and it has an impact. And I think this is an issue that's not going to go away. It's not something that anybody can ignore, because these graves, these cemeteries, these remains will continue to be found, and this work will continue to happen, regardless of the efforts of the federal government to try to do the right thing. That's just not something that we can wait for, and it's not something I can wait for. So yeah, so we've talked a lot about boarding schools and how that impacts Native Americans historically, but now today, you look at CRM, you look at archaeology, there's not that many brown faces. There's getting to be more, but there's not that many Native faces. And why is that? I don't know how much people were taught out there about the history of interactions between archaeology and Native Americans. Now, for me personally, in 1989, I went to visit a place called Chuckalissa Indian Museum, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. It's on, I believe, the east side, and which was during segregation was known as the black side of town, African American side of town. And there was excavation that took place there by an archaeologist in the 40s, 50s. And he had pedestaled all of these graves. And they built this mock village around it and made it a tourist attraction so you could come and see the ancient Indian graves. And so I visited that with my mom. I was like 9, and my mom was like bawling. So, which had a huge impact on me, because when you're a kid, you don't like to see your mom bawl, like really bawl. And I didn't know what was going on. I just remember seeing the skeletons. And then we walked through the museum. She was bawling. She had her hands over her face. We walked outside, and there was all these natives on a hill with the picket signs, and they were protesting what was happening. And I believe that they were protesting, as a result of the momentum that was occurring with the establishment of NAGPRA, which was passed that year. It could have been 88 that we were there anyway, but I know shortly after 89, NAGPRA was passed. I think that there were a lot of these protests going on at the time because people had had enough. And I think that happens in our communities where people have had enough. And I think we're at another moment where we've had enough, similar to NAGPRA. But that was my early introduction to archaeology. And I grew up, my mom took anthropology classes, which she hated. She never, I learned that archaeology was bad. I learned archaeologists were bad, that they were grave diggers. That's just what you grew up with, hearing about that. That's all they want is your bones and to dig into your grandma's grave. And so I never really took archaeology seriously. And my professors can attest to that too. I was very interested in cultural anthropology because I felt like it was more relevant to contemporary Native Americans, and archaeology really wasn't as relevant as it should be. And that was until grad school. And then I reluctantly converted and I felt like I needed to be a voice. I needed to be an advocate for our people now. And that relevance came with a strong voice to protect the sacred for our communities, and protect what was important, what's always been important, and to fight vehemently on our tribe's behalf. But I think my story is similar in a lot of ways to other tribal folks, where we're taught that anthropology and archaeologists are just kind of culture vultures, at the very least. And it's just now where you have some different minded professors that are there to mentor and to help Native communities and Native students to try to get them protecting their own and to do better for the resource. So while I think that in the past it has been a very tough, difficult relationship, I see more natives going towards anthropology and archaeology. I don't see enough Native women doing this, and I think that's a reflection of not having enough women, period, in this field either. It's been so many men, too many men. We need more Native women voices to speak for resources, especially with ours, where we have resources that are gender, like tied to gender. So like all of our roots and fruits and everything, and all of those certain foods are tied to foods that women gather. And so those things that men really aren't supposed to speak for. And also different resources relevant to that procurement of those plants and foods. So there's things that I probably can't recognize that maybe a female probably could make sense of. So we recognize that, at least in our culture, the importance of the male and female and giving a voice to the resource. So yeah, I wouldn't go out and speak for a root plant. Like that's they kind of look at me like kind of weird. And I think that's why a lot of anthropologists who come into our community, they try to, the ethnobotanists, which are a lot of times men, try to ask about women things, and they're kind of like, especially a non-native male, like, why do you want to know this? This is not your typical thing, right? So yeah, I think it can get better. I think also, in terms of trying to help Native communities, I think consultation is incredibly important, not just the formal consultation that you do under Section 106 or any of your other state laws or federal laws, but just the little C consultation. We have big C consultation, which is spelled out in law, and then the little C consultation, the staff, like talking with, like on a staff level, going to visit the community, maybe not necessarily for business, but just visiting and getting to know people. Like, I think for too long we've been isolated on these reservations, and that sometimes has an impact in terms of our approachability and and just thinking we're human. I mean, we were dehumanized for hundreds of years. I mean, mainly because we were the enemy. I mean, you hear the language in the Vietnam War, how they spoke about the Vietnamese, how they spoke about the Japanese in World War II. It was very dehumanizing. Now you take that and apply that to Native Americans. We were dehumanized for hundreds of years, and you can see it here. A lot of those stereotypical racial slurs still being said today that have been said for hundreds of years. So it was, to a lot of people, well, we're not even human. So, and we look different, we talk different, we speak English, but we speak it in a different way. We have different mannerisms. So there's a lack of familiarity, and it's weird because we're like strangers, but we're the original people of the land, and we've always been here. But to a lot of folks, we might as well be on Mars. So I think that consultation is fluid. It's also legal. Like, you have to consult. For those folks that resist that part of our laws, you have to consult. It's the law, dude. But I think it goes beyond that, in building those partnerships and cooperating, because if you're going to work in CRM, you're going to have to work with tribes. You can't avoid it. It's just a fact. You have to, because you're working with laws that require you to work with tribes. and resources that are important to tribes, and they're all important to tribes. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to share today, kind of going around in a circle, from the past through to where we're at. Um, so if there's any questions, let me know. I'm happy to entertain any or comments. Oh, I think you're muted. Me.
I think we have a couple people watching right now, so we'll give a second to see if they have any questions, since there is such a huge delay in Zoom and YouTube. I'm currently watching and it's showing you as still talking. So
Yeah.
but thank you for
Mhm.
all that. That was great. I do often, since I have recently started in CRM, I mostly just monitor, which is super boring. But I do wonder, I mean, I do, sometimes do have to monitor with tribal representatives. And besides when I get to speak with them while I'm there, I always kind of wonder, well, what else could I be doing to build that stronger relationship between myself and tribes, because I'm not native.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think conversationally, I think it's small. I people ask me that a lot. Like, how do you build a relationship? Like, how do you actually talk to natives? Like, what do you like to talk about? We don't. I mean, we watch a lot of the same shows, but I mean, Les and I were talking before. Food is a huge bridge for conversation, because we're a food based type of people. Like, we're all about our foods. Like, all like for Yakimas, our ceremonies and religious activities are directly tied to the foods. um i I think we're very different from Christianity in that way, which is not about foods, right? You go to like Catholic church and it's not about foods, but ours is like all about the foods. Like, everything revolves around food. So food is huge um bridge, I think, especially in ours, in most Native communities. And just striking up conversations. I'm so it's kind of an awkward like question, because I'm like, I don't know, because I talk to Native people all the time. um but I know food is one, um because like, there's no conflict in it, because you can't talk about politics, because you never know what you never know where that's gonna go. You can't talk about TV even sometimes. Sports is a good one though too. People like talk about sports, especially natives, because we're like huge into like watching sports. I mean, who isn't? But does that answer your question? Is that kind of the line to what you're thinking? Because I know people get shy, like we're going to hit them over the head or something, and then if you get teased by tribal members, don't take offense by that. That means we kind of like you, because teasing is a cultural thing. Like, the people we don't like are people we don't tease. So if you don't get teased after a while, then you might have to worry. But if you do get teased, we're not trying to offend you. We're just trying to get to know you. But yeah, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of teasing that goes on, a lot.
Sounds like my family.
Yeah. Yep. There we go. So, yeah, and I mean, conversationally, I mean, a lot of people, a lot of tribes, they don't want direct eye contact, especially when you first meet. If you go into a tribal office, don't write down everything they say. Don't even bring a pen and paper out. Just leave it in the backpack or whatever you're carrying, and just listen. And make and well, at least listen. I don't know about eye contact. Some tribes get offended by that, but listen. And because that whole anthropology thing, our propensity to want to go in and just write every single thing down can be offensive, because it's like, okay, it's not worth remembering. So I'm just going to write it all down. But if you actually, take the time and just listen and take it in, that's what's really important. Because my former boss, he used to always put people on the spot, who would come in like that. They would come in with their pen and paper, and they'd ask about something, and they'd write, and then they write and keep writing, and it'd go on for like 20 minutes. And then he would ask them, and he was like 85 when he passed, 86 when he passed away. Yakima man, Yakima elder. And he'd always do this. And I saw him, he said, okay, what did I say? And it was deer in headlights every time. Even though they wrote everything, they could never repeat what he said. So I'm like, well, where is that information going? If it's, you're putting it all on paper, but is it actually going in here, in your heart? Because otherwise, they're wasting their time. They're wasting that sharing of information. So it's more important that it goes in here than in here. So that, that's just like a tip I have for newbies, that are just into the tribal setting. And yeah, don't just sit down and write, listen, talk, and, and repeat or ask questions. If you have questions, ask questions about certain things, but definitely don't go in there to prod, because we don't want to be guinea pigs. Because even during the boarding schools, Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, taught all of his students about craniometrics and how to measure all of these bones and everything. Zora Neale Hurston did it in African American communities, and he taught all his other underlings, and they went out and did this on Indian boarding school students. So there's all this information out there about Indian boarding school students, all of their stature, their femur length, and all of this, their measurements of their mandible and their circumference of their head and everything. They were guinea pigs. So we've been guinea pigs since the beginning, like since, forever. Even for somebody as great as the father of American anthropology, Franz Boas. That's what we were. And that's when we say, it's kind of that, what do you call it? You don't want to be perceived as a lice or as a tick. So so go in there as a person and talk and listen.
And I feel it's really important in many cultures that I feel like us Americans and maybe even other Western societies don't really understand, that is when you're trying to, even if it's a professional setting, building relationships and connections, like at a personal level with other people, is important to them. And I saw that a lot also while I was deployed, is a lot of people don't understand the importance of building connections when in a professional setting. It's not always about business.
Yeah, exactly. Work hard, play hard. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually something that the older I get, the more I realize how important it is to just stop and talk to people, even when you're in a business setting. Like, you might have a ton of things to do, but if you don't slow down a little bit and just have those little conversations, right? Those little conversations where you learn so much about people. They just stay hard,
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, especially nowadays, where everybody's still pretty disconnected, has been disconnected from COVID, and has communicated. Some have communicated, those who know how to communicate through this method, but a lot of folks don't know how to do that on tribal communities, don't have the access to Wi-Fi, don't have access to people who know how to use that technology or anything. And have lost a lot of love. American Indians had, per capita, like the biggest impact from COVID. We've lost so many people. Our tribe had the highest numbers for death of all the tribes in the state of Washington. So it devastated our community. Well, I mean, I think at a scale that hasn't probably been felt since the Spanish flu. We haven't lost, because it was like every week and sometimes every day, like, okay, we lost somebody else, we lost somebody else, we lost them. So it's that communication, that line of communication. It's not, there's nothing that's too small, right? It's all important to establish that and have that, like, because it's been very isolating to live like that. I mean, even with 3 kids, the 3 little kids who, you have to take care of and look out for and be afraid for, as an adult, it's difficult. And a lot of our Native people live in extended family situations where you have uncles and aunts and cousins and nephews and grandsons and everyone all living in the same house, right? And so that's a lot of mouths to feed and a lot of people to be worried about. So when one person gets sick, they all get sick. So we feel that as a community very differently. And that's one of the different ways. That's how we're different, right? And from non-natives and natives, there's a lot that still live in that extended family situation, as opposed to the nuclear family. And even so, we may live in different houses, but my daughters are very close to their first and second cousins, which is probably very different than non-natives, who don't have that type of interaction. Those are like their brothers and sisters. So it's very, 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 very tight knit. And so to be isolated like that, and also to be isolated like in a school setting, like going to college, we talk about numbers, right? We talk about why are there not enough natives in anthropology? Well, there's not enough natives in college, because you're taking that human being out of their normal context where they provide certain things. Maybe they're the hunter, maybe they're the gatherer, maybe they're the person that takes their cousins to school every day, because their grandparents, who are basically their guardians because the parents are gone or whatever, can't walk them to school. So you take that person out of that role, that extended family role, that creates enormous pressures on that individual. And we're not individualistic people, and I don't mean like selfish. I just mean we're communally based people, where we're tied to our family and our community very strongly. Like, so if somebody gets sick in the household, it impacts the entire community. Like if your barber gets sick, you don't care, right? It doesn't impact you. But if in a Native community, that might, that loss of that person will impact them. So that's what I mean by individual versus community. So I don't try to like demean or make that type of value judgment on anybody. I just trying to say we're very different in that way. So you take that individual out, they go to college. What is that? Where does that leave them? Where does that leave the family? And then also the mental wear and tear on that individual, knowing that they're not going to be there to help with the family. They're not going to be there in a situation, in a place that they've never been, where there's no family, there's no support system, there's and then a lot of strange faces that are probably not Native, predominantly white. That's very difficult. That's very difficult. That's like going to the dark side of the moon. So it's not just anthropology that's failing, it's the system that's failing in education to try to get those kids to school and get the higher education. It's a big challenge. It's a big deal. And trying to elevate yourself above where you're at is also, we don't do that. We don't elevate ourselves above anybody else. We don't try to seek individual attention or accolades. We're just trying to help our community, get our education, go back to our community. So it's very difficult to try to do that in a society that is very individualistic and then go back to the communities, because you go back and people will make fun of you, people will degrade you, people will say, oh, you think you're better than us now because you have an education, you have a degree, you think you're just going to change everything, blah blah. Going back with a degree isn't necessarily always the great thing to everybody in the Native community. It's not celebrated. Like everybody's, like some Dr. Seuss cartoon where everybody's like cheering for you when you come back. It's like, no. One of the biggest mistakes is going back and thinking that you're better than your people because you have a degree. No, I was told very early, it's like, don't ever think that you're better than your people. You go back and you help, and that's what you do. So yeah, we don't elevate ourselves that way. So yeah. I'll shut up.
I was muted again.
Sorry.
Les, do you have any questions?
None that I can articulate at the moment. I got no one in my family has any degrees at either, and it's difficult to say. It's difficult to articulate how it would be perceived differently. Like, in my family, if I were to finish my degree and come back, I don't think that it would be like I'm not thinking that I'm better than them or anything, but they definitely would celebrate the fact. They would treat it as an achievement. So, and it's just because, the way that we were raised, it's one of those things where no, you don't need it, but it's a mark of the work that you put in to get where you are. At the same time, it's just as celebrated to go out there, work hard, and make achievements, make advancements in, say the job that I have, and I work for a shipping company. So it's lifting, right? You pick up boxes each day. You lift something heavy, you move it from one place to another, you teach other people how to do it safely. So at the end of the day, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we celebrate less the paper that you just earned, but more the fact that you tried to earn it.
I appreciate that. No, as I think coming from a working class, right?
Yeah.
We're very and I think a lot of that too, economic status, being that working class, and also, I mean, we were raised by Depression era. I was, raised around Depression era grandparents who had certain values as a result of their experiences from that. And the Depression hit different communities more than others. And so when you were like working class, you're lower. Indians were the lowest, right? So we were wealthy. At least a lot of them weren't. But you go through that experience, you kind of have that, you hold on to what you have. It's not about the degree, it's about what you bring to the table, the work that you do, the sweat you put in, and thank God for that. I thank God for that, those teachings. So no, I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, I was always told if you've got strong hands and a strong back, then you'll always have work.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. I watch it. And for those watching, please don't forget to click like and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to wait and watch.